Welcome to SLP Nerdcast, the #1 professional resource for evidence-based practice in speech-language pathology. I'm Kate Granbois.
And I'm Amy Wonka. We are both speech-language pathologists working in the field and co-founders of SLP Nerdcast.
Each episode of this podcast is a course offered for ASHA CEUs. Our podcast audio courses are here to help you level up your knowledge and earn those professional development hours that you need. This course, plus the corresponding short post-test, is equal to 1 certificate of attendance. To earn CEUs today and take the post-test after this session, follow the link provided in the show notes or head to slpnerdcast.com.
Before we get started, one quick disclaimer. Our courses are not meant to replace clinical advice. We do not endorse products, procedures, or other services mentioned by our guests unless otherwise specified.
We hope you enjoy the course.
Are you an SLP or related professional? The SLP Nerdcast Unlimited subscription gives members access to over 100 courses offered for ASHA CEUs and certificates of attendance. With SLP Nerdcast membership, you can earn unlimited CEUs all year at any time. SLP Nerdcast courses are unique, evidence-based, with a focus on information that is useful. When you join SLP Nerdcast as a member, you'll have access to the best online platform for continuing education in speech and language pathology. Join as a member today and save 10% using code NERDCASTER10. The link for membership is in the show notes.
Hi there, my name is Corey Clements. I'm the SLP Nerdcast Resource Specialist. It's my job to help you link research and practice. I seek out resources that are rooted in evidence and bring them to your fingertips. You can head on over to our resource library and check out all the available resources we already have for you. You can find me at resources@slpnerdcast.com. I can't wait to help you link research and practice.
This episode is a bit different than our typical episode. This episode is part of a conference called SLP Linked. The focus and purpose of SLP Linked is to connect research directly with practice. Each session as part of this conference will discuss what research looks like in our therapy rooms. Our goal is to bring you this content at least once every year to help you bring research into your therapy spaces and bring you therapy activities and ideas from the researchers themselves. Stay tuned for more information about the conference, but for now, on to the episode. Welcome everyone to SLP Linked. I am so excited to welcome everyone to our 5th session of this conference. I am here today with an expert guest who was also my professor in graduate school. So we had a nice little chat leading up to this moment. We're here today to talk about research and practice, specifically with regards to stuttering. And I'm here with Dr. Amit Bajaj. Welcome, Amit.
Hi, thank you, Kate. Nice to be here.
Before I ask you all the questions and we get into all the nerdy stuff, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Amit Bajaj. I've been at Emerson College for a very long time. I'm originally from India. I teach graduate courses in the Communication Sciences and Disorders program at Emerson College, more specifically the graduate course in Stuttering. I've also taught a whole bunch of other courses over the years. I'm also a person who utters, received therapy many years ago. I'm also, for the last 3 or 4 years, been sort of very involved with the Indian Stammering Association, called TISA. So I'm part of the stuttering community in India. I attend the virtual lounges. I mentor and coach some people in India on a one-on-one basis. So I'm kind of seeped in teaching, some practice, some research, kind of all of the above.
And I will say you are a wonderful professor. Personal experience verified. We had a lot of fun in your classroom and I learned a ton. And for those of you who are new to SLP Nerdcast, my name is Kate. I own a private practice outside of Boston. I'm also a dually certified BCBA and Emerson alum, which I feel like I have to say now as part of my introduction and disclosure. And I have been a co-host for SLP Nerdcast for a few years now. I do need to read our learning objectives and our financial and non-financial disclosures before we get into all of the good stuff. So I will get through that as quickly as I can. Learning objective number 1, describe a piece of research related to stuttering. And learning objective number 2, describe 3 research-informed therapy activities that exemplify research in practice. Disclosures, Amit's financial disclosures. Amit receives a salary from Emerson College and received an honorarium for participating in this course. Amit's non-financial disclosures. Amit has no non-financial relationships to disclose. Kate, that's me. My financial disclosures, I am the owner and founder of Grandbois Therapy and Consulting LLC and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures, I'm a member of ASHA SIG 12 and I serve on the AAC Advisory Group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy. Okay, so we're here to talk about what research looks like in practice, specifically with regards to stuttering. Can you tell us a little bit about the article that you want to review?
Sure. So there's an issue of topics and language disorders, number 42, which came out in January to March 2022, which looks at uttering beyond disfluencies. So looking at the connection between stuttering and language, looking at the relationship between stuttering and neurodiversity. So the attempt is to move beyond looking at uttering from a purely a speech production lens and to look at it in the wider context of how language factors influence it, how we manage it in terms of not focusing exclusively on speech fluency, focusing more on acceptance, spending more time on counseling, spending a lot of time in developing, better quality of life than actually dealing with the actual physical aspect of stuttering, which has consumed a lot of our attention and interest over the years. So there is a piece in the article in that particular edition of Topics and Language Disorders. It's by 2 very notable experts in the field. One is Shelley Brundage, and the other is Nan Bernstein-Ratner, who've done a lot of work over the years. They're also co-authors in the Handbook of Stuttering, the most recent edition of that came out. The article is called Linguistic Aspects of Stuttering, Research Updates on the Language Fluency Interface, in which they've summarized basically research in the 1930s, published research in the 1930s, exploring this relationship between language variables and the stuttering frequency and the intensity with which it occurs. And so pretty much what I'm going to tell you in terms of the research, the one piece of research or a couple of pieces of research that we're talking about is coming out of that one piece because it's already been very well summarized. I recommend the article highly because it is very, very accessible, very readable, written, of course, like I said, by 2 notable experts, and it has lots of very good implications for how we go about working with stuttering in the process. So it sets the stage for a lot of the evidence-based practice that we are trying to do. I will pause and take any comments or questions from you now.
Okay, so as we have discussed on this show before, a lot of us are working with really high caseloads without a lot of time. So we love an article it provides a good summary that's accessible and really informative. I guess my first question is, why is this important? Why are considering the linguistic aspects of stuttering an important thing for us to consider?
Yeah, it's a great question. For one, it's important because it's important across the age span, but let's talk more about children, right? So stuttering tends to emerge roughly between the ages of 2 and 5 years of age. Lots of individual variation in that range, but it's basically a condition that emerges during childhood where there's a huge amount of neuroplasticity that is there in kids, and there's a lot of very rapid physical development, language development, cognitive development concentrated in that 3 or 4 year time span. So we see a lot of typical disfluencies and stuttering emerge at this time. And very often, parents are concerned, obviously, when a child begins to show some signs of uttering. So very often we understand the developmental context in which stuttering tends to emerge. Obviously, if everything is developing at the same time, there's a lot of competition for nascent neuronal resources. The brain is young, the brain is developing. So just like children will fall and will stumble when they're learning to walk, they will also stumble in their speech when they're learning to talk. So at one level, the connection between language and stuttering is tremendously important, because you want to be able to sort out what are the typically developmental disfluencies that children have, the language-based disfluencies. Most children will show some language-based disfluencies as they are learning the language and speech, and developing these in these multiple domains simultaneously. But sorting that out with actual stuttering behavior. And language comes into it quite a bit, because research also indicates that a lot of children who stutter tend to have concomitant problems in articulation, in language, in executive function. So it becomes a really important thing to appraise and to work with at that particular age span. Then, in terms of the other aspects of the connection between language and stuttering that the article addresses, is the fact that people who stutter, people like me, tend to stutter when we are saying something that is long, grammatically complex, and has multisyllabic vocabulary. That's been a fairly robust finding, quite a robust finding through the early investigations on this sort of an interaction between language and stuttering that came out of the 1930s all the way through. This has been a fairly robust finding. So then, if language interacts, or let's just say language influences this stuttering behavior in such predictable ways, then how do we address, how do we construct, how do we develop therapy materials, and how do we administer therapy, for example, when you're talking about speech motor techniques, motor techniques, by taking into account these language influences? So it's an important question from both sides, both from a diagnosis side and appraisal side, appraising the capacities of children, not just in speech, but also in cognition, in language, in affect, socially, how they're doing, which I think is the whole body approach. And also specifically using materials where we are able to scaffold, use language as a scaffold to build some improved speech fluency, because in that process we are able to give people the maximum chance of being successful, right? So if stuttering tends to occur when we are saying something long versus short, whether it's an utterance or a sentence or a word, which is multisyllabic, versus monosyllabic, grammatically complex, so it has main clauses, subordinate clauses, all of those kinds of things, and it has high propositional content. Obviously, those aspects can be manipulated in the way we teach speech motor techniques. So the typical tendency is to recommend that we start out practicing speech motor techniques at the single word level, moving it on to a two-word level, using it in structured interactions, tasks which are structured and predictable, and then moving it on to tasks that are less structured, less predictable, language that is longer, more spontaneous. So scaffolding language to build speech fluency becomes a really important thing, because the evidence indicates that language factors such as grammatical complexity, such as utterance length, such as multisyllabic vocabulary, have fairly predictable effects on the likelihood of stuttering occurring in those particular linguistic contexts.
Well, when you describe it that way, I am sort of shocked that I ever would have separated language from stuttering. I think as a field, we tend to classify stuttering as a quote speech sound disorder, which I think from my understanding, could be approached without a lot of consideration for language. But you've clearly made the point that they are very, very closely tied together. And I am looking forward to hearing a little bit more about what this might look like. You've already mentioned that the evidence for this is robust, and it sounds like there have been publications of this relationship for decades.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's a fairly robust connection. The caveat is that the most of the data that has been available for the language fluency connection is come from English. So it has not been widely researched across different languages. We don't expect it to be that different in other languages, because languages are not going to impose completely different cognitive neurological constraints on people in one language versus the other. But there is that caveat that there isn't data available from a lot of other languages, and this is based largely on English. So that's the only caveat. But aside from that, it's a fairly robust finding.
That makes a lot of sense. You've already mentioned some of the results from this article that you wanted to review. You've mentioned language scaffolds and a whole body approach. Could you expand on those and just sort of highlight what the results of this article say, what those look like?
Yeah, so the article talks about, we like to talk about applications. I like to think about it as implications. We can certainly think about applications on our own in our own particular context, but there are lots of implications of this for the force or the work that we do. So one is that so let me talk about these two pieces of research which are summarized in the article. They summarize several other aspects which are related to all of this, but I'll highlight two. One is the first point, that there is a connection between language features and their influence on speech motor production, particularly fluency, so that long utterances, grammatically complex utterances, multisyllabic vocabulary tend to yield more stuttering in a person. So that's one part of it. And obviously, the implications of this are language scaffolds, to be able to teach speech motor techniques, whatever they are, to teach speech motor adaptations in a sequence that recognizes that influence. And therefore, going from shorter, simpler utterances, monosyllabic utterances, to more complex ones, going from highly structured tasks to less structured tasks. So speech pathologists may already be doing a lot of this, because this comes to us also. I mean, our treatment is founded on that as well. When you're working on somebody's articulation skills, you would also be working in some sort of a linguistic and task hierarchy. So at one level, speech pathologists are already very familiar with working in a linguistic and working through a linguistic and task hierarchy. But I think what this does is, what the article does is, what this kind of summary does is, it provides a very robust basis for doing so. So if you are a speech pathologist and you are looking for materials to use with your kids who stutter, for example, in the school, try to create a sequence that is very respectful of this linguistic and task hierarchy. Of course, everything depends upon the child's own language skills. So if they are at a precocious language level, you're going to adapt that hierarchy and that sequence to the particular person. But the template should be to start from something simpler, both linguistically and from a task standpoint, and then move it up, because this is evidence-based practice, because there's robust sort of evidence that links language features to the stuttering behavior. So that's one. The other is the idea that there's been a lot of research also to indicate that children who stutter tend to have concomitant issues, particularly in articulation, language, and more recently, there's been some research also on executive function. So there's a correlation between ADHD and uttering. Because of that, it becomes really important to be able to appraise more widely, to assess more widely, to not just focus on the speech production aspects, but also look at functioning in other domains. So one of the handy acronyms that exists in our field in terms of the domains is CALMS: cognitive, affective, linguistic, motoric, and social. We want to be able to appraise in some way, in some measure, standardized, non-standardized, where the child is at cognitively, where the child is at in terms of the linguistic skills, what is the motoric capacity of the child, both articulation and speech fluency, what is the affect. There's been a lot of research over the last 10 to 15 years in stuttering, singling out temperament in children who stutter as a really important variable that contributes to the persistence of stuttering beyond childhood. Obviously, if I'm a child and if I'm very sensitive to the disruptions in my speech, I'm emotionally affected by it. I have that kind of a temperament that is more reactive and less regulated. I am more likely to conditioned to the behaviors very quickly. So appraising affect, appraising temperament is really important. Understanding social functioning is going to be important because that interfaces with the environmental variables. What is the, how is the child communicating at home? How are they communicating in the school? So because stuttering is also environmentally cued, appraising the stammering experience, the stuttering experience, not just in terms of the number of syllables that are stuttered or the physical tension in the speech, that's one part of it. But we need to look much beyond that, way beyond that, and look at all of these domains of functioning in a structured, standardized kind of a way.
And this brings me to another question I wanted to ask you, sort of zooming out and looking at the whole person and all of these variables that you've mentioned. On the podcast before, we have talked a lot about acceptance and counseling as being a primary focus for clinicians. So if you're a clinician listening and your 2 o'clock session is a child who stutters, you may feel, or one of the messages that we've heard pretty frequently is not to focus on fluency as the goal. Fluency is not the goal. And to really bring more of that counseling and acceptance into our therapy rooms versus addressing some of these modification techniques. I wonder how you could you talk to us a little bit about how those two different priorities might both be present in a therapy room?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it goes back to looking at stuttering from a neurodiversity lens, right? There's been a lot of writings on that recently. I'll tell you my take on this because, both as a person who works in this stammering space and also a person who stammers as well, I have a particular lens through which I look at this whole neurodiversity movement. I think at once, this point about looking at stuttering from a neurodiversity lens, and this is where acceptance comes in and counseling comes in quite a bit, is at once a very banal point and a profound one. It's a very obvious point or banal point because at one level, really any function is on a continuum. Hearing acuity is on a continuum. Reading ability is on a continuum. Speech production is on a continuum. Everything pretty much is on a continuum. You have outliers pretty much in anything. At one level, so saying that stuttering is a facet of neurodiversity is not telling anything new. Why I think it's a profound point at the same time is that we have not treated stuttering that way. We have tried to normalize as much as, and by normalize, I mean going the opposite, trying to approximate to the norm of of typical fluent speech, put people who stutter in a condition, in a situation where in an effort to help them not stutter, actually furthered the social stigma inadvertently. Because now if I've gone through let's say a fluency shaping program for 4 or 5 weeks, and if I'm not able to make those techniques stick, then I blame myself thinking like I must be doing something wrong, not really understanding that stuttering in speech doesn't quite function that way for a lot of folks. So at one point, it's a very profound point to make because I think that grounds us into what is really important for the person who utters. The other point I want to make along with this whole notion of neurodiversity is that just because something is a facet of neurodiversity doesn't mean it doesn't create interference in your life. If I have poor reading acuity, reading ability, that's going to impact how I show up in the classroom. If I have a speech impairment where I'm spending a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of tension, getting my words out, that's going to naturally create interference in communication. So there are ways of managing the interference effects that are there regardless of something is a facet of neurodiversity or not, and we can manage them in multiple different ways. You can manage the interference that stuttering is causing by telling your listener that you're a person who utters, starting with self-disclosure. You can manage the interference by adjusting expectations in that way. You can be fully accepting of this one part of your identity. You can also manage the interference, frankly, by managing the more attention in your speech in a slightly different kind of a way. So I don't think these things are exclusive. Acceptance and change are not really exclusive. They're all related points. It is because I accept the fact that I'm a person who utters, that's uttering has been and will continue to be most likely an enduring presence in my body, that I can voluntarily stutter before you as I'm doing right now, so I can practice my pullouts, which would be managing the tension mid-stutter as I'm doing right now. Now, that's much harder to do for me if I haven't told you that I'm a person who stutters, if I haven't told you that I'm going to be using my techniques, right? So there's a lot of connection between acceptance and change, and acceptance makes change possible in that way. So I'll just leave it at that and essentially round up with the fact that uttering sure is an aspect of neurodiversity, but like any aspect of neurodiversity, if you're an outlier, it's going to cause interference in your life in some way, and there are multiple ways of managing that.
I appreciate that delineation, particularly for those of us who have really put a lot of effort into shifting focus away from making fluency the goal and really trying to bring in more of this counseling and acceptance. I really appreciate just the point that they don't have to be competing priorities, that they can coexist depending on your client and their goals, really with a focus of, still making person-centered care our goal as clinicians. So now that we've gone through the research, we've discussed the evidence, the robustness of the findings of the evidence, I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what this looks like in our therapy room. So something that we've said a few times throughout this conference, if it's the hypothetical clinician standing in the speech closet, trying to choose what to do to embody this research in their sessions throughout the rest of the day, what does this look like?
Yeah, it can look like many different things, right? It can look like playing with our speech, practicing our utters in an easier way, in a lighter way. It can mean voluntarily stuttering in a lighter way and a way. All of that stuff is very much part of the work that we do, and it recognizes, stuttering from a neurodiversity lens. But if you're actually working to make some changes in the speech behavior to manage the more attention in this speech, and let's say you're working with a child and you are encouraging, let's say, smooth speech or slow talking, or let's just say stretchy speech, which is a way of saying vowel prolongations. When we stretch out our vowels, as I'm doing right now, very selectively pulling out the vowels in my speech sounds and stretching them a little bit, I'm altering the rhythm of the speech production, and therefore I'm inducing more fluent speech in my speech, more fluency in my speech. So whatever you're doing, whatever these speech motor techniques are that you're working, let's say, on children, I think it's very important to think about a language sequence and a task sequence. So if you're expecting the verbal output from the child to be at the single word level, there's lots of games that will allow us to do that. An example would be, looking at objects in the room and naming colors. You're at a single word level. Looking at pulling objects out of a grab bag and saying 2 sentences about them or 2 words about them, right? So that's another thing that builds on a single word sort of a response. Doing it in these highly structured environments first, and then putting the demand on the child to sort of like take it to a next level. So if you're looking at a sentence formulation task, looking at various pictures on a page and you're trying to formulate sentences around this, maybe you shouldn't start with that as the first thing, but it's something that could be so a task like that could be a very high demanding task to start out with, but it could be a fantastic task to offer later on in the treatment sequence. Storytelling, for example, using a technique like easy speech or smooth speech and telling a story for about 60 seconds, right? Doing something like that shouldn't be the first thing that the child does if they've been taught to use a technique. It should be one of the last things that they do, because there's a lot of grammatical formulation involved. Obviously, if the child tells a story, they're going to speak in longer utterances, grammatically complex utterances at a faster rate, most likely, because all these things are related, using more multisyllabic vocabulary where there are going to be more transitions across syllables, more opportunities to trip up in that way. So obviously those tasks should be reserved for later on, because right off the bat, it's a complex task. It's going to involve complex language. So something like that, this basic thinking, this particular mindset should be really, really important. And also understanding that something that is less demanding for a child later on may be more demanding right now. So being able to read the student, being able to understand the student, understanding the language profile of the student becomes really important, which is why a whole body approach where appraising language skills of the child that you're working with becomes important as well. One of the books that is actually on that slide, which I came across recently, is a really nice one called You Read to Me, I'll Read to You. So right here, this is a book called You Read to Me, I'll Read You. It's basically a reading book, and it's basically a joint reading exercise, right? So you have 2 voices, 2 conversations that happen in different colors, like this. I mean, these are really short stories that you can read with a child. So let's say you're the SLP and you say, I see a mouse. Child says, I see one too. And then you say together, we see 2 mice. What shall we do? Then you as the SLP says, let's give them names. And the child says, what shall they be? So it's a conversation that is happening that respects that language hierarchy, that has the little task. It's a simpler task because you're looking at the shared page together. So we know it's very predictable as to what is, what has to be said. It also practices turn taking and listening, right? It's a reading activity that actually encapsulates all of those things that we're talking about in one. So that's one more example that you can use with kids who are readers.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for showing the book. I have that book in my home. I've read it with my kids. It's affordable. It's very helpful. I also think there are probably a lot of other board books or other literacy-based activities that we could modify.
Absolutely.
And we're going to talk about
tons of stuff.
Yeah, we're going to talk about adaptability later in this conference as part of our breakout groups. I really appreciate the integration of the counseling and person-centered approach with managing some of these motoric aspects of stuttering. And I think most of us, we have turn-taking games in our speech closets. It's very easy to create a descriptive or grab bag activity where we're slowly building on those linguistic units, making things more complicated, scaffolding them to the language level of the learner. And for those of us working in a school, using some of the literacy or curriculum-based activities that are available in our classrooms based on the thematic unit that we're doing, that's also a really accessible suggestion for all of us. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for being here. It was so fun for me to do this with you, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I appreciate it as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you for attending this session of SLP Linked. ASHA CE processing and certificates of completion for SLP Linked are exclusive to SLP Nerdcast members. SLP Nerdcast members also receive access to live events, a downloadable series program, access to 2 bonus courses related to how to adapt these materials across modality, cultural competency, and skill level, as well as access to our speakers, content experts, and researchers through a private discussion board. If you have any questions about becoming an SLP Nerdcast member or you need any accommodations for this course, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thanks so much for attending, and we hope to hear from you soon. Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon.